And just in closing, sir, just to clarify, I understand that the feds serve as kind of the backstop, given how the closure process occurred. Again, you said that they're now in Chapter 11, and you're confident that they do have, and as a part of their reorg, you're confident that they will have the resources to pay for the cleanup.
Let me clarify, they have emerged from Chapter 11.
Okay.
So they are no longer in bankruptcy. They emerged from Chapter 11 at the end of March, and they are now a restructured enterprise going forward. They have an obligation under our order to make payments into a closure trust fund. At the time they emerged from bankruptcy, they had already paid about $16 million in financial assurance against the cost of future closure. They are making additional payments into that trust fund over the next 3 years. While they make those payments into the trust fund, they will also be directly paying for the work of the closure that they are bringing forward. Normally, when a facility goes into closure, it is allowed to reimburse itself for its work in closure from the trust fund. The order that we signed in March does not allow Exide to do that. The funds that are held in trust remain held in trust through the entire closure process. At that time, they roll forward into trust funds that act as assurance against cleanup costs on-site and off-site, so that those funds remain in place as a backstop through closure, on-site and off-site cleanup, including residential cleanup, until the job is done. I should also point out that the order and our regulations require Exide to pay for the entire cost of the closure and the cleanup, even if it is more than what we estimated that they had to make financial assurance for. So if it's more than what's in that trust fund, they still have to pay for it. When the whole thing is done, they can request reimbursement from what is in the trust fund, and if it doesn't cover all their costs, they've still paid for the entire thing. We will use the full extent of our authority to enforce those agreements. We are continuing to monitor the work that they're doing. I have staff on site every day that work is being done. In the last 6 months, we have expended over 13,000 hours of staff time on Exide alone. We will continue to watch them very closely as we go forward to make sure that the closure is done properly, that it is done safely, and that the community is not harmed or exposed to harm by the closure work. We're working in a very coordinated way with the South Coast Air Quality Management District. We're working in a coordinated way with the LA County Department of Public Health, and we're working also with the CUPA because they have certain responsibilities in ensuring that things are done properly with the closure. One of the shortcomings of how we approached Exide and other sites in the past has been that it's been very siloed. And there are things that probably would have triggered better response from us had we known about them, and now we know. My experience in this process, just in working with the South Coast Air District, is that we saw on numerous occasions the facility came to us and said, well, we can't do what you're suggesting we do because the South Coast Air District won't let us do it. And I said, call them up and ask them. And it turns out the South Coast said, well, they haven't asked us about that. And they had the same experience. So we now share everything. On a routine basis, we're in continual contact. And that allows us to have a very tight net around the work that's being done. And we've taken that effort and we're expanding it into other areas.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Mitchell. Before we go on with the questions, I just want to ask Aina, how are you doing? Absolutely. Okay. Awesome. We will take a 5-minute break. So stay tuned, everybody.
Thank you.
Ms. Mitchell has asked her questions. We may come back to any of our colleagues on the Rules Committee if they wish to do so. Why don't we go with Ms. Connie Leyva? Ms. Leyva.
Thank you, Mr. Pro Tem. Good afternoon, Ms. Lee. First, I'd like to thank you for coming by the office and spending a good amount of time with me talking about issues. And also thank you for taking on this monumental task. You are obviously a very smart individual. However, as I told you when we met, you are in a position where you are going to be at some point or somewhat paying for the sins of the past. But moving forward, it's my job and the job of everybody on the Rules Committee to hold your feet to the fire. So I'm going to start with an easy question, an easy yes or no question. DTSC seems to have a lot of tools in its toolbox. My question is, are you willing to use the hammer in that toolbox on people who blatantly violate polluting in our neighborhoods and our communities?
Yes, I am, and Exide is the proof.
Okay, good answer. We're off to a good start. So I had the opportunity to go on what is lovingly called the Toxic Tour in my district a few weeks ago, and I'm very grateful for that, because if we don't know about issues, then we don't have the opportunity to fix those issues. To say that I found it appalling would be an understatement, but it's probably the strongest word that I can think of. I'll start by saying after the tour, I read that the Cal Enviro screen in South Pomona is in the 97th percentile for pollution, the 98th percentile for solid waste, the 95th percentile for particulate matter, and the 97th percentile for poor drinking water. And it's also the 97th percentile for poverty. So that is very disturbing. And what is even more disturbing is not just in Pomona, but throughout the district when I toured it, is the only place we had these issues or these problems were in poor communities. So my concern is that we are targeting poor people, and that when these waste or recyclers come into town, no one seems to have a problem as long as they open them where there are poor people. So just if you could expand on that a little bit, or give me your opinion or how you think DTSC will handle that in the future.
I appreciate that question. I also have been to the community in the industrial zone in Pomona. I had the benefit of a tour put together by the People's Senate, and I learned, as you mentioned, quite a lot on that tour. There is nothing that can replace the value of seeing firsthand and hearing firsthand the experiences of the people in these communities that we have to protect. It's a challenging problem. There are a number of different regulatory agencies whose jurisdictions intersect in these communities. Part of what I'm doing, as I mentioned earlier, is trying to work collaboratively with all of those jurisdictions to identify how we can make the situation better, instead of simply looking at it through the lens of, is any piece of this mine? That, I think, is an approach that the communities have wanted and needed for a long time. I have a history of working collaboratively with other agencies and across the spectrum of interests in regions and on topics. So that collaborative approach is key. Certainly being aware of the problems is also critical. And then the next step is being able to identify what the steps are that need to be taken in response to those problems, whether it's collaboratively with other co-regulators or just within DTSC. When you and I spoke, one of the things we talked about is the investigations that have already been underway in the industrial zone in Pomona. And one of the things we talked about is that those investigations take a long time to wind their way through the process. So one of the things that my chief counsel has done is he's guided the Office of Criminal Investigation, which used to be under him and is now under our hazardous waste management program, to undertake one of those Lean Six Sigma projects that we were speaking about earlier, to use that to shorten the time it takes from the point in time when the investigation itself, the field work is done, to when we refer the case for prosecution. And our goal is to reduce that from an average of 2 years to an average of 6 months. And we're very confident we're going to be able to do that. So it's working collaboratively. It's reaching out with the community stakeholders and seeing the problems, understanding the problems, and then doing things where we have the authority to do them, like these investigations. If there are permitted facilities, making sure the facilities are following their permits, that their permits are up to date, all of those things are in order. If there are site cleanups that either are underway or need to be undertaken in those areas, making sure that those are started and are moved forward at a good pace.
So to your comment about working together and different agencies working together, Mission Recycling, Pomona Scrap Metal, Recycled Wood Products, and SA Recycling, do they fall under DTSC?
Yes, they do. We have the ability, if they are generating hazardous waste, to intersect with them. And so in some cases, the question of whether it is hazardous waste is based on sampling of the waste. So we go out, it's an operation that could generate waste that qualifies as hazardous waste. We go out, we sample it. If it does, that gets a certain track of activity going. If it isn't under our purview, it's under the CUPA's purview. And so we work with the local CUPA to make sure that whatever obligations those facilities have, they are meeting them.
Okay. You talked about investigations. I want to specifically ask about the forensic experts, Enrique Beza and Peter Wood, who in the spring of 2014 started an investigation. I know you were not with the department then. Where are we at with that specific investigation? Is it ongoing? Has it been stopped?
The investigation hasn't been stopped. It is in that process I described that takes a little bit longer than we would like it to take. I can't really talk about the specifics of the investigation when the investigation is underway. It is confidential, and certainly when we have prosecutors involved and they're working on their case, we can't talk about that at all. So without disclosing any information about the investigation itself, I will say that they did collect evidence. We are evaluating that. It's in the process. And when we're at a point in time where we can discuss it with you, we will definitely come and discuss it with you.
And I will reiterate what I asked when we met. I would like to meet with Mr. Beza and Mr. Wood as soon as feasibly possible. That said, I want to ask about the peace officers that are employed by DTSC. And I have some information that in 2005, the department investigators asked prosecutors to bring charges against polluters involved in 45 investigations. Those numbers have fallen to 2 requests for enforcement in 2011, 1 in 2012, and none in 2013. So really my question is, what are they doing?
The statistics you're citing are a little bit different from some of the ones I'm using. So I would like to get back to you and make sure we're looking at the same numbers. We do have prosecutors. We do have, we do have criminal investigators. They are peace officers. They do investigations. They have been involved in investigations over the last few years. They have participated in a number of statewide investigations, and sometimes how those are discussed publicly, it isn't clear to people that DTSC is involved, supporting and allowing the conviction of the crimes that occur and that are uncovered as part of the investigation. I believe in the last 4 or 5 years, The Office of Criminal Investigation has participated in cases that have resulted in over $100 million in fines paid statewide. These are cases that are brought not only by the Attorney General, but also by local district attorneys and city attorneys. So the numbers you have may not reflect the work that happens in that column, but the investigators are very busy on those efforts, and where these are activities that span jurisdictions, the statewide cases are really the best way to bring them.
So maybe a little more transparency. I want to make sure it goes back to that toolbox, and that we're using all the tools we have in that toolbox. And it really does seem like DTSC has some very powerful tools to use, and that we need to bring those to bear. That there are some violators who look at the fines that they receive as just a cost of doing business. So we need to make sure that these fines are painful, quite honestly, to be deterrent, and that their behavior stops. We had a long talk. I could go on for a long time. So in the interest of time, I will just ask, as I did when we met, for weekly updates from your office. You may either speak with me directly, or you may speak with my Chief of Staff, Corey Ayala. As I also said, I am not your enemy. I want to help you on this, but I also will be watching very closely, because these are my people and the people up and down the state, and I'm very concerned about them. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Leyva, our Vice Chair of the Rules Committee. Senator Fuller.
I appreciate the time you spent with me and others, and I think everybody's covered this subject pretty well, and obviously their districts are closer to the problem. So I will just echo Senator Leyva's comments about transparency, I think, and Senator Mitchell's about lack of criteria. The complaints I've received are more on the other side, that they don't know what the criteria is for being listed as a subject before they're determined to be bad, and why they would be listed before they're determined to be bad, and then later taken off the list or determined to be bad. And so it seems to me, when I reviewed the whole thing, that, well, you know, while a lot of this is new on your watch, and you've been there 8 months, which isn't very long, except that that's almost as long as all of your predecessors, that this bill, that this problem that's going on is that there's a lot of time being spent on little details and picking out substances that maybe aren't that harmful to be listed, causing a whole lot of uproar that's unnecessary, and the bigger problems, which are much harder to manage, are maybe not prioritized by the staff or someone as quickly. So that's number one. Number two is, you know, the department has been very slow getting back to members of the legislature when constituents haven't been able to get their problems solved one way or the other on both sides of the issue, either too much or too little, doesn't matter which. So the legislature's having a little problem when they intervene on behalf of their constituents getting attention. However, having seen the pure amount of pending things that have to be, what I think it's 1,100 or something, anyway, a huge amount of pending items that need to be fixed, and about 194 million in uncollected cleanup cost, and at least 3 areas that need to be addressed by the legislature, as well as 6 audit items that you actually have fixed. I think I'm going to let Senator Leyva and the Pro Tem keep an eye on this, and I will keep an open mind, but I just don't know how you can do this fast enough, given the collaboratory consensus, lack of standards kind of mode. It's sort of like you're the only person out there, but if you're willing to be the only person out there, then we'll watch and see if we can't help, because obviously the 9 that went before you didn't receive any help, and we're not able to finish their goal, and at least you're willing to stand up and try. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. To my colleagues, Senator Mitchell, Ms. Leyva, obviously Madam Vice Chair, if any other questions or perhaps any commentaries at the moment? Seeing none, okay, thank you very much then. Let's go to a couple more points before we get to the members here. I know that we have other folks there. You may want to arrange your schedules and go ahead and you feel free to do so while we continue this committee. Okay. Madam Vice Chair, I think, touched the subject of cost recovery. Obviously, the state auditor found as of March 2014, DTSC had 1,661 projects totaling almost $194 million, of which are unbilled or billed, but to date uncollected for cleanup costs. These are the outstanding costs. So there's a lot of money that's out there still left on the table. What is happening with the recovery of the costs of these scofflaws who have been fined by DTSC but have yet to give their money or to have that money collected by DTSC?
As you observed, there was an audit. It was an audit that the department requested. And that audit found that over the history of the department, within the cleanup program, the department had spent $1.9 billion on the cleanup of contaminated sites to return them to beneficial use. And of that $1.9 billion, about 10%, or $194 million, we had not accounted for or recovered those costs. And these are costs associated with cleanup activities, and where there are responsible parties, they should pay for it. So the department embarked on an effort to identify what the status of those costs was. To date, we have resolved about $59 million of the $194 million. We've also referred $70 million worth of costs for legal action, and that can include prosecution, that can include negotiations, settlement negotiations. The company may be in bankruptcy, and so there are legal proceedings around that. There are a number of different legal actions that can be taken, and we've referred cases amounting to about $70 million for that. We have about $1 million in what we call small debts. These are debts of under $5,000 where the cost of recovering those debts would exceed the amount we would actually recover. And we, I understand that there is a bill that Mr. Alejo, Assemblymember Alejo, has brought forward that would give us better tools to write off some of those costs where we have determined that it's too expensive to go after them, and also give us other tools to help recover costs going forward. I should point out that that $1 million in small debts amounts to a third of the total cases that were unresolved and half of the cases we have remaining to resolve. So even though it's a small amount of total money, it's a lot of cases and a lot of work. So writing those off might be a good idea. And so within the $63.4 million that remains unresolved, $18.6 million, we have gone through the cases and figured out what documentation is needed to resolve it, and in those cases, we've issued the bill to the entity that should be paying for the cleanup. There are $44 million in unresolved costs where we haven't issued a bill yet, and that is because we haven't gone through the individual case to make sure that the bill is appropriate, that we have the documentation we need, and that we need to, are ready to move forward. We will complete all of these cost recovery activities regarding the total $194 million by the end of this fiscal year.
If we'd be so kind enough at the Senate Rules Committee to ask a question, and I believe I have that question here, which is obviously Miss Mitchell broached Vernon. It says here in 2011, DTSC started discovery projects in both Vernon as well as Commerce. And in December of 2012, DTS did initial testing that showed high levels of chlorinated hydrocarbon in the city of Commerce at the specific plating Eastern Triggs site. I'll state it one more time. It's called the specific plating Eastern Triggs site. 2.5 years after the site was identified, no further testing has been completed. So the question I have here from Ms. Garcia is, what is the department doing on this site and similar sites with recalcitrant or confused responsible parties?
It's an excellent question, Mr. Pro Tem. I am not familiar with that specific site, and I will definitely get information back to the Assembly member about it. Generally speaking, I've been going through each of the programs. We've done permitting, as I talked about. We are embarking on this effort for enforcement, and the next up will be our cleanup program. And as I mentioned, I'm going through and working with staff to identify what the process is that we need to be going through, what the standards are that we need to be shooting for, and what the metrics are that will hold us accountable.
Okay.
So those will be in place in the cleanup program, and sites like that will not slip through the cracks.
Okay, so what I would highly suggest is, again, for your staff who's in the audience right now, it is, and I have in quotation marks, it's the specific plating / Eastern Triggs, that's TRIGGS, site, and is in the city of Commerce. So the question here is chlorinated hydrocarbon that has been discovered in the initial testing, high levels. As of today, since the first initial testing, there has been no follow-up whatsoever from DTSC. So I would highly suggest that you report back to Assemblywoman Ms. Garcia sooner rather than later. I liked what Ms. Mitchell talked about with regards to executive management, which is very, very important. And as we all know, I'm going to state the obvious, humans create culture. I think one of the questions here is, does the culture that's comprised of these staff members of DTSC, do they go with you? Do they follow you? Do they follow your leadership? Or do they practice the art of passive resistance and perhaps the art of subterfuge? Because again, 10 years and 10 different leaders shows that executive management comes in and quickly goes out. But staff remains. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important that obviously that you have the backup, that you have the unequivocal support, that you're not set up for failure. Because if you fail, that means that this department, DTSC, fails, or is continually going to fail. And if that means, if it's going to continuously fail, that means the harm of the community as a whole will continue to still be in peril. So I want to get your thoughts. Do you have, I'm going to state the obvious, but I want to really hear it from you. Do you have the unequivocal support of Matthew Rodriguez, the Secretary of Cal EPA? The reason why I say this is that you need backup. You need support from the Secretary of Cal EPA, Matthew Rodriguez. Obviously, the governor appointed you, but you need the governor's backup. And you need the horseshoe downstairs to back you up. You cannot do this alone. I think it's been proven already that they have, for lack of a better way to say it, they have chewed up past directors and they have left, or they have been pushed out, or a combination thereof. You need strong support, obviously, from Secretary Cal EPA Matthew Rodriguez. I have a lot of respect for him. We spent some time together in Lima, Peru, the COP Conference of Parties 20 on climate change. I hold him in very high regards. You need support from the executive branch, specifically, obviously, the governor's executive staff. An average of 1 year is not good. Based on my own methodology, and don't ask me to explain it because it's a hunch, that I have, a gut feeling, and I don't know what your future looks like, your own personal future with regards to what you want to do with your own career. But I think this position needs someone to be here at least 4 years, at least minimum 4 years, if in fact you're going to really implement these types of reforms and see it through and make sure it's embedded within the culture. So do you have the backing, the unequivocal backing and support of Secretary Cali PA Matthew Rodriguez? And is this staff going to, follow, your leadership?
Secretary Rodriguez has been fully supportive of me. He has helped me with staffing resources from his own staff where I have needed that support on some key policy issues, and that's been incredibly helpful. So I'm very grateful to him for the support he has given me. This administration is a very good administration to work for, in my opinion. I have been very impressed by the caliber of the people that I work with, by the team nature of the work that is done. It's a very good working environment. People are very interested and engaged, and I definitely feel like I have the opportunity to bring forward issues that need their attention and have their support resolving them.